welcome everyone to the fourth installment of our series titled Outside the Ivory Tower, where we break down how academics engage with practitioners and external audiences through media such as books, blogs, newsletters, podcasts, and more. We have the next hour together, and as we go through it, I'd like to request everyone here to keep your video on so we can see who's present and engage in the Q&A. And of course, at any point as we move forward, just feel free to jump in with questions by raising your hand and unmuting your mic when ready. If you prefer to drop your question in the chat instead, that works too. But since we have a small group here today, hopefully we can keep it interactive. Okay, so for today's interview, we're delighted to have Andrew Brodsky joining us. Andrew is an assistant professor of management at UT Austin's McCombs School of Business, former colleague of mine. His research centers on individual work-based technology usage and workplace communication challenges. And he's particularly interested in the overlapping area of workplace virtual communication. And jumping off that interest, he's actually recently published a book. He's the author of Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication. And Poets and Quants has also named him one of the top 40 MBA professors under 40 years old in the world. Andrew's conducted research, consulted and led training around the world in organizations such as Novo Nordisk, PwC, Dell, and Amazon. His work has been covered in major media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, The Economist, Harvard Business Review, and CNBC, among many others. He earned his PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard Business School, and he has a bachelor's in economics from the Wharton School at UPenn. So certainly a very impressive roster of accomplishments. Welcome, Andrew. We're delighted to have you here, and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start from the beginning. You are, an assistant professor at UT. You're working on, writing all of these research papers, and that's, quite an uphill battle for most of us, starting out. So a few years in, you decide that you want to write a book, and lo and behold, you actually go ahead and do it. So I would love to hear about what the motivation was to start, just what motivated you to do that, particularly at that point in your career, whether it's something you've always wanted to do, or something that kind of came to you at a certain point in your time as you were doing your research.
Great question. So for me, it was probably a combination of two factors. First was that I've enjoyed writing research for, our peer-reviewed journals, but for me, one of the more fun parts is after the fact, getting to write some kind of piece for a more general audience. So whether that's in Harvard Business Review or elsewhere, because that's when I tend to get a lot of feedback from broader audiences as opposed to just other professors. So I've always enjoyed kind of getting that broader perspective on my research. And secondarily, my topic is virtual communication. There really I figured this would probably be the best time of my life to write this book. Everyone was kind of returning to the office. It would have been a little bit better if if I had written the book maybe a couple years earlier during COVID, but I was like still way too junior then that I was like just starting to roll around the ideas about it. So for me, it seemed like A, something I just would really enjoy, and B, this was the moment when my research would probably be its largest amount of relevance in my career. So I just decided to go for it.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I'm curious, as you were thinking about disseminating your work to others, we now have many distribution platforms from which to do this, right? So book writing has always been the most traditional approach, but you have podcasts, you have blogs, you just have all these other media. So what was the motivation for writing a book specifically? Do you find that that kind of lends you more authority, helps clarify your thinking? I can imagine a host of reasons. So I'm curious to hear from you why a book.
Yeah, to me, a book is a much bigger idea and much more thorough. any kind of article that you write for, I've written a few for Wall Street Journal, a couple or a few for HBR, like they're short, singular, focused pieces. For me, the next logical step was I want to kind of do something really big. And it was well timed too, because I had a review paper with Haley Blunden on virtual impression management that just got published right around the time that I leaned heavily on for a good chunk of the book, at least. So it fit really well together there.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I also wanted to talk about the timing, right? So you
Mhm.
mentioned writing this book, like just starting off as assistant professor might have been way too much, but you were at a point in your career where you had published some, you had the knowledge base, but
Mhm.
you're also still on that assistant professor track. So wondering if you saw that as being somehow in conflict with the book writing process, just in terms of workload or what the institution encourages, and what would you recommend specifically to an assistant professor audience in terms of the timing of when to write their book and the kind of the trade-offs to consider?
Good question. So there's always that conflict. One of the things I teach my school's Intro OB PhD seminar, and one of the things I talk to PhD students about is you have to find your right balance between enjoying what you do and striving purely for the metrics that matter in our field. And because if all you're trying to do, unless you truly are like, that's what you love most in life is trying to publish, AMJs, JPs, ASQs, you're going to burn out. So finding that balance is important to maintain that passion and enjoyment of our field while still making sure you're successful. To the bigger question though, is this good or bad for an assistant professor to do? I would say it is leaning on the bad side in terms of career success. So first, there are some clear benefits. It got me more well known in the field. It also got me access to a lot more field sites, which is a really useful commodity. Data is one of the things that are most useful for us. Another thing too is doing stuff like this energizes me. So even though it takes a lot of time, there is some positive spillover into my other work because if I was just responding to reviewer letters all day long, my productivity would start sliding down. So there is some positive spillover. That said, the process is obviously very time consuming to write a book. We may get into it later, but the editing process can be more or less work. The publicity process, more or less work, depending on your experience. And my school, UT, I would say as an institution, they very much valued the book because in my case, I was lucky enough to get a whole lot of press when the book came out. A few articles in Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Newsweek, New York Times, CNBC, all of them. Like there's a ton of it. And my school like was publicizing it. So like every email that went out was kind of noting one of the articles that came out recently to alumni, to other stakeholders in the school. But for my annual evaluations, there is no area for book. They only pretty much rank you based on your peer-reviewed publications for research, and then obviously you're teaching stuff separately in service. And this doesn't fit under teaching or service. And because there's no real section for book and research, it didn't help my evaluation. So to the extent that I possibly could have gotten another article or two, or maybe even three, if I hadn't written the book, this was not necessarily the best idea from a pure performance perspective within my institution, but from a life happiness perspective and feeling like I have meaning to what I'm doing, I found it very valuable.
Mm. Yeah, that's really insightful because I mean, as the saying goes, it's a cliche, but it's true. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's truly the case. And I think where you're saying here echoes a lot of what we've heard in some of the other conversations. So recently, sat down with Jim Dieter, as I'd mentioned, and he also talked about this sort of flywheel that he has between his research, teaching, and any sort of external engagement via book, because they're all sort of on the same topic or similar topic. And so it feels like it could be three different things if there were three different topics, but because they're not, there's things that you can gain that even actually help you in your research if you go ahead and you write this book. So in your case, it was field sites, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Which is maybe not in the short term, maybe, this year or two doesn't help you get a publication, but maybe the
Yeah.
next, who knows, like 5 years down the line, it actually manifests to something positive on that side as well. But I think, as, scholars who study intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and like meaningfulness and happiness, and we know how valuable those things are to longevity in any career, it's helpful to get this perspective, I think, to not forget that as an assistant professor. So yeah, thank you.
Cool.
Um,
Virgil, I think Sid had something, right?
oh,
I have
oh,
just a
question.
quick question is, so you mentioned writing the book, obviously, and then you mentioned articles like Wall Street Journal. Does that give you like the same kind of joy, but just a different scale, or is it a different kind of satisfaction that you get from, say, a New York Times article or Wall Street Journal article versus writing the book? And do you recommend some to persistent professors or different people, or are you happy the way it went about, or would you change it? How would that work?
Yeah, so I mean, a Wall Street Journal article or HBR article, Wall Street Journal article is a little bit easier to write, although a little harder to get into. That's very brief. You get like a very brief period of potential attention for it, and it's a smaller, kind of much smaller conversation to it. So I like doing those every so often because I can like intermittently have that kind of feel like I'm having that impact. Because you can't write a book, every few months or something. So when I can do those, it's like nice because it's like a little boost of like, yes, my research matters outside the Ivory Tower as a topic of this. But the book is it's just a much bigger story, and a whole lot of extra things stem from the book. Like you're not generally getting podcast invites off of HBR or Wall Street Journal article. Maybe you'll have one company reach out to you off that stuff, maybe two if you're lucky. Whereas for the book, you get a lot more stuff that kind of happens to it. In part, though, because you're spending so much more effort publicizing it. So some of that is also effort based in the back end.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd also actually like to go on just a small detour and a little bit deeper into the getting feel sites bit, right? So you write this book. Um, how does something like that happen? Do companies, leaders read your book and then reach out to you and say that they actually want to collaborate with you on research? Or does the book give you a sort of some credibility or platform to say, hey, I'm an expert, and by the way, I'm looking to collect data. Your organization seems interesting. Would you like to have a conversation? So I'm curious, just like which way did that flow?
I would say in this case, the book was more about getting me attention, so inbound leads, in like the words of marketers. So I had a lot more companies in this case reaching out to me. Some were more for like speaking engagements, more like the paid kind of thing. Others were more about collaborations. Sometimes one turned into the other and vice versa. So maybe we couldn't agree to a structure for something paid, but they had like good data. So we're like, let's do that instead. Um, in that case, at least in my view, the book didn't add a tremendous amount beyond having a couple of HBRs under my belt, I would say. I think if they're looking for someone who's an expert on this topic and you're approaching them, if you've had a couple of these clear practitioner focused articles, I think the incremental value of the book is not necessarily as much unless maybe you get to like New York Times bestseller level, like going to Adam Grant level or something like that, where you're like starting to become a household name, which I'm definitely not. But for me, I found it was much more useful for inbound leads, I would say, as opposed to legitimacy, at least from where I was at previously.
Great, very helpful. So I'd like to now sort of talk to you a little bit more about the process of starting to write and pitch and develop a book really as a project, right?
Mhm.
For anybody in the audience who's interested in writing a book and doesn't know where to start, what would you tell them? And if you had to sort of create a recipe, a stepwise process,
Mhm.
what does that look like and what did it look like for you?
Yeah, so the first thing you're generally going to need is a literary agent. Even though we've got all this research on principal agent problem and how like agents are just kind of often attacks on the system, the issue is that you're not seen as legitimate to publishers without an agent. And oftentimes too, literary agents can give you a lot of knowledge that's implicit and not obvious. So the way that I found mine is I reached out to senior professors in our field who had written a book and asked if they might be have any know of any agents who might be interested in my pitch. And then I had a general, very short pitch ready for agents at that point. And I was lucky enough through my network to get a few connections, pitched a few agents. And then I had a couple offers for representation and one I settled on. Agents are going to be very different in the degree to which they work with you on the pitch that you're going to send to publishers. My agent was very, very involved in helping to craft the pitch for my book. So for nonfiction books, you don't write the book before you send it to publishers. You just have this pitch about the book. Mine, and she's my agent Sylvie Carr, who's actually no longer an agent. She works at Anthropic at the moment, actually. But yeah, she had a few really big books that were a hit. So like books from Jake Knapp, who's big at Google, and a few other ones as well. But I guess she got a really one of those crazy AI offers that wooed her away. But she was amazing. So she spent so much time with me crafting and honing this pitch. Mine was a bit more detailed than most, so I actually went into a pretty full outline for my book and my pitch, which generally many do not go into as detailed as mine did. And then what happens once you've perfected your pitch with your agent, who may or may give more or less feedback in terms of that. So some agents are more just send me your pitch, we'll do some minor editing, and then I'll send it off. Some are more hand in hand. At that point, she then sent it to publishers to try and get interest. There's like the big five publishing houses that, you want to get to bid on your books. And because it's a business book, you also might get Harvard Business Publishing bidding on it as well. And there's like a couple other kind of these smaller presses, but also just as legitimate. Um, the way the publishing houses are set up is interesting. So there's a lot of sub-publishing houses within each one. It's like Simon Schuster has a lot of sub-publishing houses. Penguin does. Hachette does. And in theory, they're all supposed to compete with one another and not really collaborate. But basically, so in my case, there was one from Simon Schuster that was interested. There was one from Hachette that was really interested. And there were a couple from Hachette that had indicated they were interested to my agent, but wouldn't bid because they knew one of the other sub-publishing houses was interested. So even though they're not supposed to, the way it's set up, they're not supposed to coordinate like that. Within a publishing house, the sub-publishing houses tend to coordinate a little bit. So it's not just you get one, you may actually have multiple bidders from Hachette or multiple bidders from Simon Schuster, but often in practice, it tends to be reduced through them talking in the back to kind of, so they're not just pushing up each other's ones. And then I had Harvard Business Publishing was also interested. So in the end, we had three bidders on the book and for the North America rights. And I ended up going with Simon Schuster for North America. And then they do kind of, and then separately, once the book is a little further along in the editing process, start going for international rights. And then Penguin was actually the one who has my international rights outside of North America, in that situation. And then more foreign language ones happen post-publication. And then I think of Pegasus for Turkish, which is like the first language it's being interpreted in, which is interesting that like that was the one that's the first. But so that's like the very brief overview of that process.
And that is actually super helpful. Just knowing that there's some level of collusion, it seems, at least
Yeah.
within, if not, between publishing houses. Um, so follow-up questions from that include one, what made you select the publishing house that you did? Was it just who bid the most, or were
Mhm.
there some qualitative factors that you also considered? And were you even able to glean that from the pitches? Because people can say a lot of things about how
Mhm.
they're going to help you, but how do you vet that?
Mhm.
So yeah, curious what that was like.
So yeah, so it's a good question. The three publishing houses, we had Harvard Business Press, Hachette, and Simon Schuster. The sub house in Hachette that was bidding for my book, They had a bit more of an academic list of authors. So they had like historians, philosophers as their set of their set of authors. Whereas the one at Simon Schuster, they had much more like mainstream business books.
Mhm.
And then Harvard Business Publishing, which is great, they often don't have as much as a reach as like the big five traditional publishers do. So at the beginning, I was leaning towards this publisher, Simon Schuster, for this one before, and Simon Element was a sub-publishing house within Simon Schuster, and they actually created a new sub-publishing house right around the start of my book for like just their business imprint. Beforehand, Simon Element was like more broad advice books, and then they created a new sub-imprint from around the time mine started. So I was leaning towards them initially. They actually had the highest bid tied with Harvard Business Publishing. So we kind of went back and did a little post-auction negotiation with them to push them up a little bit. And also Simon Schuster had bid for worldwide rights as opposed to just North America, which Harvard Business Publishing did. So we got them to, in addition to pushing up the offer a little bit, to go down to North America only rights. Actually, I think at the end of my book, I actually talk about my bidding auction because it's a good lesson on virtual communication about how we kept changing modes during it, depending on the situation. So I actually talk about in the like the conclusion, the auction that kind of occurred there.
Right. Yeah, so this actually leads into a question I was meaning to ask later, but since we're talking about the bidding process, people are interested in what the financials look like for writing and selling a book, what goes into it, what influences it. So first, in terms of getting, an agent and a
Mhm.
publisher, and then in terms of getting a bid that you thought was fair,
Mhm.
enough for you to actually work on this project. Um, what do you think you brought to the table that helped you, whether it was, a fancy PhD or some credibility with like other awards and things that you'd won? Um, excuse me. And what did the range of offers look like?
Yeah, so offers for books are like all over the place. I think for business academics, they're probably less than they used to be because it's getting more and more crowded, and not as many of the books are really breaking out as much as they used to. And I think the book industry as a whole has been having kind of issues where fewer people are reading, and it's causing problems. But I mean, I can speak to kind of variation on this. So, I mean, a offer from any of these publishers are generally going to be probably mid five figures, all for a first time author, all the way up to mid six figures. There's not necessarily a whole rhyme or reason to it in many cases. So for instance, I know another author, not a professor, who wrote a book on what I would consider a fairly niche business topic. And this author did, was well-ish known in their area, but not didn't have any kind of big following. And they got a book off, their advance was over $500,000. And their book ended up selling substantially worse than mine did. My advance was far less than that. Um, you know, I would guess these days that if you can get an offer from major publishing house, it's probably in the 100s range, I would say. It's like 100 and something in most cases. The things that were probably most helpful for me were a fewfold. One, my agent knew everyone. So like she reached out directly to people at these publishing houses that she knew. So it wasn't just she sent it through their cold system. So the agent is kind of one thing. Secondarily, I had a blurb from Adam Grant, which was useful on my pitch. So usually you don't get endorsements from people until you have the book written before it's out. Luckily, Adam was a mentor of mine when I was an undergrad, and he was super supportive during this process. So I think showing that I would be able to get large endorsements was very useful. Um, and I'm sure the 40 under 40 MBA professor, the HBRs, and the PhD from a well-known place definitely put their finger on the scale as well. because it showed I would have more credibility with the general audience who doesn't understand that some of these cues are not as valuable as they would seem necessarily at face value. But they're kind of simpler things. So I think that really would be what I would say is the mix of it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The usual suspects. Yeah, and it's useful to just have a range in mind. Of course, it always varies, but even before you start the process, to know that, okay, if you are taking a year off, to do this, well, no one, well, that's the other question. Most people don't get a year off, but a year of
Yeah.
extra time spent eating into your evenings and weekends and mornings to do this, then, here's what you can expect
Yeah.
to help support that. So that, yeah, that's great. You had a
Do you want me
follow-up?
to? I was saying we can go into more real quick.
Yeah.
I would say financially, it's probably not worth it at the end. Given A, the huge time commitment, and B, if you want it done seriously, you have to pay for a publicist, which will
Mm.
eat a good chunk of that. So the amount that and then you do get, if things go well, you do get some speaking and other engagement afterwards. So I would say for me, it was it was probably, I'd say break even worth my time, maybe a little bit of a loss. But for the most part, you know, unless you get lucky, it's not, I would say, based on what salaries are for most people at R1s, it's not going to necessarily be like a big boon for you. It may be like, okay, yeah, that was worth it, or maybe it wasn't, but it's generally not going to be like, you should do it for the finances, I would say.
Yeah, that seems to be consistent amongst, I think, most, except for perhaps the top, 1% who are in a league of their own. But yeah, that is actually a very consistent view, especially now with AI and just so many other means of content generation, which we'll get to as well as we move forward. So I want to kind of again go back to that early time. So you pitch, you get an agent, you get bid, you decide on a publisher, you start writing.
Hmm.
What does the writing process look like for you? Now you said most of the time for nonfiction books, you don't write the book beforehand. Um, some people do, maybe if there's some anxiety or at least a few chapters, but it really just depends on what your style is and if you're actually using some of the pre-book writing to discover if there's a there to begin with.
Hmm.
So for you, it sounds like you didn't do that. And then you had this deadline, which I imagine was a year into a year after,
Maybe a little bit more, yeah, than a
a
year, yeah.
little bit more, yeah. So how did you manage that? Writing is hard and we have to do
Yeah.
enough of it anyway in our jobs. So I would love to hear what your habits were like and your processes to actually
Yeah.
accomplishing this big goal.
So for me, I had it pretty thoroughly outlined in the pitch. So it's mostly just expanding and fleshing out the outline. And also I find this type of writing much easier
Mhm.
than writing for a peer review journal. Because like for a peer review journal, you're like spending hours sometimes wrestling over a single sentence to make sure they're not going to like find a flaw in it or you forgot to cite someone's theory. So, you can write like paragraphs. Often the time it can take you to write a couple sentences for a journal article. And in my case, often we're not doing our efforts individually. My wife and I are both very supportive of each other's careers, and she used to be, is no longer a fantasy author. And she'd published 16 books. So I had an author in residence who could help me get through writing blocks, who could help give me advice, who could help me copy edit things really well. So I was very, very lucky in that situation. Back when she was writing herself, I'd copy edit. I definitely think I get the better end of the deal because it's much more fun to copy edit and help with fantasy books than it is business books. But that was definitely useful for me. But I mean, I was able to write it pretty quickly within a few months, I would say. Just because I'd been thinking about it so much. I've been thinking about this book for long before I wrote it. The longest parts, like, it's like I probably spent 20% of the time writing 80% of the book, and then 80% of the time writing the last 20% of the book. Just because that's the tricky part, like finding the right stories and the right way to frame things. and maybe, figuring out ways to reconcile conflicting research in our field in a way that general audience would care about, because you can't like get too nitty-gritty into it. They don't care about like, three-way interactions and those kind of things. So that was useful there. My understanding, I've only done one book, but your editor at the publishing house, so my editor at Simon Schuster, some of them are like super, super intense. Mine was not at all. Um, I'm gonna say maybe it was a testament to that I'm a really good writer and I'm married to someone who's really good at making sure my writing sounds even better. But my editor barely made any changes to the book, and it was mostly what I would consider grammar copy editing, and there wasn't any real rewrites whatsoever. So it was like my easiest R&R I've ever had in my life. That's not necessarily true. So some editors, some publishing houses will have you rewrite whole things, cut chapters, change things. Mine did very, very minor grammar corrections, would be what I would say in my case. And so it was a very easy process going through the editor.
So what I'm hearing is have a secret weapon at home and
Yeah.
lean into your unfair advantages in every way that you can. It's probably
Yeah, and I
true in
think
business and life, I guess.
yeah. I mean, all of this is about connections, right? It's like
Right.
we know network effects in our field, like, and the issue is for these publishers, they have no idea who's going to write a good book or who's going to do this. So they're using whatever signals they can, even if they're like really bad signals that are just due to your luck. Like, I happened to take Adam Grant's very first class at Wharton before anyone knew who he was in the school. It was like impossible afterwards to get into his classes because they were so full.
Mm.
But I got him his first year. So like, and then I was able to build a relationship that way. And if I hadn't been there at the right time, I might not have made that connection that opened a whole lot of doors and all those things. So, I mean, a lot of this is going to be arbitrary, but most people in our field can build those networks to different people
Mhm.
within your area who have those louder voices who might help be able to amplify you in these kind of situations.
Great. So you've written the book. Okay, so you've gone through the process. It's written, it's out there, it's coming out there. What does the marketing process look like? Uh,
Hmm.
did that start sort of towards the end as you were wrapping up with your publisher's help? Does that start the moment the book is out? I'd love to hear what the preparation is like to get the book out there. Um, and the means with which you've done it. Is it going on podcasts, writing articles about the book?
Hmm.
And who's doing most of the work there? Is it the
Hmm.
publisher or is it you? Uh, and at what point does it maybe switch from being a lot of outbound, like I have this thing, please read it, it's great, and share it, to now people are discovering the book and reaching out to you for your time.
Hmm. Yeah. So, the first thing I'd note when you're going into, trying to publicize your book is to go into the realistic view that you're probably not going to make any extra money beyond your advance.
Mhm.
So there was a New York Times article, I think, talked about it, where there's like something between 163 and 270 titles per year sell over 100,000 copies. And that's across all topics. So we're talking about Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Adam Grant, obviously. And so if you think about 160 to 270 titles a year sell over 100,000 copies, that is not a lot of room for someone like Andrew Brodsky, who like no one really knows that much outside of our field. And if you think about how many copies you need to break even in advance, for $100,000 advance, you get different amounts of royalties for like ebooks versus paper versus hardcover versus audiobook. But figure you're going to have to sell close to 30,000 copies just to break even on a $100,000 advance before you start seeing another penny. So you need to sell if you have a $100,000 advance, you need to sell over 30,000 copies before you start seeing a penny because you have to earn back your advance first. And if you think about, we know distributions, right? So there's 160 to 270 books in the world, including J.K. Rowling, Oprah, all those that sell 100,000 copies. There's not a whole lot more that are selling over 30,000 copies either. There's a big like left skew towards zero
Mhm.
there. So odds of earning back your advance are generally low. So your thought about PR and those kind of things is like, do you want how much is it worth it for you to get your message out there? And then potentially, ideally, earn back some of those PR efforts on speaking or consulting engagements there afterwards. So there is some upside to that, but it's probably not going to be through your publisher unless you end up pretty lucky. I was tracking a number of books from management professors that were released around the time of my book. And I think of just to like benchmark myself, because I always like to know how I'm doing. And I think of the 10 books I was tracking, only one of them seems like it might have earned back their advance. And I had some suspicions that that author potentially engaged in a service to buy their own copies of their book. So this is something that some authors do to up the ranks of their book. Is basically you can hire these services that will buy copies of your book that look like individuals, and that ups the ranking of your book. And then you can use those copies to give away when you're doing events and other things, or send them to other faculty to give out to other people. So the idea is you're kind of using those books later on, but you've bought a whole bunch of them to boost your ranking. But anyway, it's possible that one person actually did not do that, but there was some things that led me to think that's possible. But anyway, pretty much we all had a similar experience. But the publicity was useful for getting speaking and consulting and field sites. So first off is very rarely is a publisher going to do much publicity for your book. My publisher actually did get the New York Times article, although that was fairly late and somewhat unexpected. And they got like a couple other little things. I would say 98% of my publicity, well, let me split it. 98% of my publicity did not come from my publisher. Of the publicity that didn't come from my publisher, I would say maybe it was 60% from a public relations company I hired based on the recommendation of my agent, and 40% from my connections. So whenever I'd been interviewed by an outlet previously about my research, I always save that journalist's name and I try to stay in touch with them. And that's also how I was able to start writing for the Wall Street Journal. Is they'd covered my research previously and interviewed me, and I kind of kept in touch and that kind of thing. So you hire a PR firm, and they're especially useful for getting podcast interviews, as well as getting some kind of media hits in the process because they know the different people who to reach out to. There's not a good way to cold submit to the bigger podcasts. So you really need someone who knows the producer for that podcast, to be able to get in there to get that attention. And so that takes out, hiring a PR agency, if you want to get one of the good ones, it takes a good chunk out of your advance. Although it's a nice tax deduction, at least against that advance. So it's not a full loss.
That is so informative. So you mentioned staying in touch with some of these journalists, which is
Mhm.
something, that I've been curious about because often, they'll get in touch with you, you write the one article and then it's done. And you don't, unless you're writing the next article, there isn't really a reason to drop an email and say, hey, what's up? I'm just trying to stay in touch. Nobody does that. Nobody wants to get emails like that. So I'm wondering, what does maintaining these relationships and staying in touch look like?
Yeah, so usually whenever I have new research coming out before it's actually live on the internet, I send an email, say, hey, not sure if you're interested in this topic, but I have a new paper coming out. It's not out yet, so you could be the only one covering it initially if you want. If not, no worries. I'll keep you in mind for future stuff. Also, if you need any connections for any topics, feel free to send me a note and I'll send you in the right direction. So sometimes they'll reach out to me for like referrals of like who's covering this that would be useful. But generally I just like send a very nice note whenever I have new research, offering them the kind of initial coverage if they're so inclined.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Very helpful tip. Uh, so you talked a little bit about how you did get some consulting engagements off
Mhm.
of this, some talks. What does that piece look like for you, in terms of volume? Again, contributions to earning outside of your advance, which is again something you said you should not expect, but if it happens here or there, how
Mhm.
do you negotiate those deals, and what are the expectations that you set for yourself in terms of what is worth it? How much does it vary? So I'm just curious to know about that entire ecosystem,
Mhm.
the consulting and speaking engagements part of it.
Yeah. So for me, most primarily, it's been speaking. There's this issue where like you have to figure out your rate, which is always very messy. It's useful to talk to other people who are doing it to find out what they're charging. The problem is if you charge too little, you're not looked at as an expert. But to charge the degree you need to be an expert, you're going to be out of the range of many companies who would be interested in paying for you to do a talk. So it kind of creates this weird conundrum where you have to figure out like, I want to look like I'm legitimate, but that means it's going to kind of cut out other companies. So I think doing research and talking to people who have a similar profile to you is useful. So like, I can't charge as much as someone who's a New York Times bestseller or someone who's at a Wharton or Harvard or Stanford. University of Texas is a great school, but doesn't have the elite recognition of like the Stanfords, MITs, all that. So I wouldn't charge as much for that kind of thing. And then usually when companies reach out to me, sometimes they just think I want to do something for free. And I'm like, for their customers too. I'm like, no, I do not want to do a free marketing event for your customers. Like, this is like, that's weird. I'm not going to sponsor your company here, for nothing.
Right.
So, sometimes companies know exactly what's involved and they'll ask, what's my rate, right, in the first email. Sometimes I have to say, like, listen, I'm really busy at the moment. So I'm only taking on compensated speaking events. And then there's sometimes a negotiation back and forth. So I'll say, here's my rate. They'll say I can only do this amount. And then I'll decide, am I okay with that amount? Do I want to push? Uh, Another thing to remember with all of these events, not all of them, but a number of them, there's often some headache involved in it that you don't expect. For instance, I just had an event recently where I had to follow up with them, I don't know, like 8 times afterwards to get paid. And when they finally paid me, they wired the money to the wrong place. So they didn't read the wire instructions correctly, and I had no way to access it. And they're trying to get me to call my bank. I'm like, you didn't include my name in the wire. You literally sent the money to Ally Bank as the recipient instead of Andrew Brodsky. I'm like, I get, and so like this was like a long thing. So you need to price up extra, not just the time you're doing the talk, assuming they're going to have a big ask for you maybe beforehand or afterwards you didn't realize about. They want you to record, they didn't mention it, but they want you to record 4 promo 30-second videos. They didn't mention it, but getting paid by them is a pain in the butt on the back end. So you always want to add in some hassle factor there as well, for those cases. So that's generally what I've done. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. For like nonprofits or organizations that, are like for the common good, those I will often do for free. I'm not going to charge some of these organizations. They clearly have a low budget and they actually have a beneficial thing. But, if you're a company that's like, health insurance, I'm not, arguably whether that's a good or bad cause, that's not something that it's a charity situation, obviously. So it would depend on it. And sometimes, the talk doesn't work out, but data does. And that opens the door to that conversation because, well, we can't afford you, but hey, we'll give you all of our data to get some of your expertise. And then I'm like, that works too.
Yep, that makes sense. I'm wondering if there's a particular profile of organization that's interested in having academics speak, or you know, who calls you for these sorts of consulting engagements, so that if you did want to proactively reach out to them, like what are the best group of companies to do this with. It might be a hard question since I
Yeah.
imagine it's topic specific, but again, organizations can mean so many different things. Is it the big tech companies? Is it mid-sized companies? I mean, who's picking up this book? Let's just take this book
Yeah.
as an example and saying, I want to do something with the author, especially given that there's so many books that are published every year and so many business books. So what does it really
Mhm.
take to catch someone's attention and have them reach out to you, other than writing a great book, of course?
So yeah, so now it's funny. My wife, who I mentioned, is a fantasy author. She's actually now a marketing executive. So she does a lot of lead gen, and so I get to see a lot of how that works on the ground beyond just kind of what was my education during my PhD and what I hear from other professors. I don't do lead like demand generation outbound.
Mhm.
Uh, if you want to do that, it is very, very time consuming to get this done right. And there's generally a pretty big cost of getting the contact information for the right person. Because you can imagine if you're a decision maker in a company, so let's say you're VP of HR or you're the CPO, you're getting inundated with B2B offers for different software, for different consulting firms. And to try and break through that, you have to have an actual marketing team, in my view. So others may disagree, but I find that reaching out is probably going to be highly inefficient and have a very, very low hit rate. And I'm not in the business of trying to be a full-time marketing person. So all of my leads were what we would say inbound or organic leads, where basically they reached out to me. The profile of companies are pretty mixed. I mean, for the most part, they're going to be larger companies because, no one's paying thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars an hour for someone's time. That's a small company for the most part. Um, it's kind of random at times who does. I had a couple real estate companies that are like real estate or mortgage adjacent, like right in the same week, reach out to me for talks. I don't know if my book had made it to some real estate conference or something where it had been mentioned, and suddenly that's why I got a couple of them. Often it's tech companies, though. They're often the ones who have the big pockets or willing to bring in interesting people to do talks for different ones. But and same thing with book sales. I'll often see because I have a website where I have like resources for the book. I'll often see like clusters of downloads or I can track book sales from my publisher. They have like a tracking website for Simon Schuster, and I'll see like clusters of buys that maybe had to do the reading group or a conference or something. So it's kind of chunky, I would say. And there's often long periods of silence, and suddenly there's a few things and then nothing. So it varies a whole lot.
Makes sense. So now you've gone through this process, you've written the book,
Mhm.
you've marketed it with the help of your publisher and agent and yourself, and then you've gotten things come out of it, right? Speaking engagements, field sites, and things like that. Um, Being on the other side of that process, taking a step back, what has surprised you about this process? Something you didn't know perhaps before you got into it, and now having experienced it, it's new information that you take into account when maybe thinking about writing another book or ever doing something like this again.
Mhm.
Both positive surprise, negative surprise. What was unexpected?
Let me think about it. That's a good question. So, I even though I knew it, I'd say it was unexpected how little my publisher did for the most part.
Mm.
Was involved in the process as a whole. And from talking to other authors, that's not that abnormal of a story. I know another author who had a different publisher and they didn't hire a PR firm. And even though it was one of the main publishers, the main publishing houses, and they'd gotten a very good advance, that was better than mine, they got like almost no media whatsoever. Like their book came out and there was no attention to it whatsoever. So like you really have to drive this stuff yourself. And in my case, my agent had a good referral for a good PR firm. That was useful and they were very helpful for me in that regard. But you really if you don't drive it yourself, if you don't get a PR firm, your book will probably disappear completely and no one will read it.
Mhm.
Which is unfortunate because you think, oh, the publisher has a vested interest. They just paid you potentially, six figures for this book that they would, but not really necessarily the case, at all. And that's not abnormal from talking to a lot of other authors. Positives, another negative thing, like sometimes like really dumb things happen during this process where like things get canceled really at the last minute. You would think like for some of these huge podcasts, they'd be like super professional or even media outlets. Um, so like funny story, I guess. For the New York Times article, that they did, they interviewed a couple other professors who had studied virtual communication in it, but like I was mentioned the most, my book was mentioned. She ended the article with a joke. Um, about her texting a coworker, or the coworker had asked for a meeting or something, and she said, I'm guessing you're too busty, like busty." And then she was talking about, like, basically saying how she had a typo that was embarrassing because it was based on what I was talking to her about. The problem was the formatting of the article. She put the joke in the same paragraph I had a quote of, and she said I afterwards to make it seem like I was the one making a joke. Whereas talking, I decided A, I texted a female coworker about being busty, and B, I thought it was a good idea to tell the New York Times a story about how I texted a female coworker about being busty. And there's no paragraph break between my quote and this joke. It's in the same paragraph. And so I was like, I can't share this New York Times article. It makes me look like this is horrendous. Like, A, the joke was bad taste anyway, even though it came from a woman. But B, it would be especially bad taste. It came from me. And then I decided to tell the New York Times about this situation. And I think she noticed like a junior coworker or something. So I'm like, can we add a line break in there? And they were like, no. So I never really share that New York Times article outward because it makes me look really bad due to a lack of a line break.
Well,
Um,
that is unfortunate.
yeah. So there's like always like funny, dumb things that happen along the way. But yeah, so it's been an adventure and it's been fun. I would definitely have done it again for the fun of it. I think career-wise, probably hurt me more than helped me. I mean, for my ego, it helps me. Like I feel like more people know me and they ask me questions and invite me to sessions like this. But for like my annual evaluations and getting tenure and all those things probably hurt me. And financially, probably about break even, I would say, for the amount of time I put in there. So on the whole, though, because I really enjoyed it, I would do it again.
Okay, yeah, that was one of the questions I had. You would do it again, and do you have a specific book project in mind already, or is it just something like maybe someday?
I'm taking a break for now. I'm not jumping right to the next one. I'm gonna wait for the right opportunity too. So eventually, but not yet.
Okay. Um, One of the things as well that came up in what you just said is this idea that the publisher did not help you very much in marketing the book, which again, as you mentioned, is surprising given how much they spend on it. Um, but I'm wondering, like, why do you think that is? Like, why is that? Do they say that they will and then not do it because it's in their interest to, or is that just sort of expected that you're going to get a publicist? And then related to that, does it then make sense to self-publish, which is something more authors are doing these days, or is it still, despite often this lack of support, better to go at least for your first book with a traditional publisher?
Yeah. So, my publisher never really promised to promote the book heavily. They never do that because they never know.
Mhm.
I think publishers are often the profit margins on these things are pretty slim for most part. So it's almost like a VC model where
Mhm.
the vast, as I noted, like when New York Times said what 270 books maybe or sell over 100,000 copies. So basically, the vast majority of the books they publish lose money,
Mhm.
uh, and they're wanting to get the few that become these unicorns effectively. So they don't overinvest like in any of them or many of them unless they know they're necessarily a sure thing in most cases. And they
Mhm.
kind of assume that you're going to do it. And that's it. My publisher didn't do nothing. I mean, they got the New York Times mention that was sort of good. They got me a couple podcasts, although it was a very minority of them. And I think they got me like one TV interview for a big city's local news station, but not like national. So it wasn't like, and then a couple of like other minor articles in the passing, but so it wasn't nothing. And like for most people, like a New York Times article is huge, but when you have a book out, like one single article does not make a big deal for it. Like even the New York Times article, I saw, I think there was like maybe like 30 book sales that happened after that one. So we're not talking about like that led to hundreds or even thousands of book sales. It was like a small handful of them. So you need like a lot of things for that to happen. So I think it's a lot of part they take this VC model to this. And it's kind of, I guess, common knowledge, although not to all authors, because some don't do it, that you really have to invest in it yourself to push it. And I forgot the second part of your question already.
Well, the self-publishing
Oh,
bit.
self-publishing.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the thing about self-publishing is that it often doesn't have the legitimacy of regular publishing. And so you run into a few problems. One, if you want to, my book was in Barnes and Nobles and bookstores. That generally does not happen if you're self-publishing. So if you want to be able to walk into the bookstore and grab a physical copy of the book, and that only happens after you're already successful with self-publishing. But my book was there already, right when it came out, kind of. Secondarily, the media will often not cover self-published books. So it's seen as a sign of like legitimacy and authority to have a publisher behind it. So if your only goal is to make money, self-publish, it's hard, especially with AI and the inundation of books that are coming out right now. Your self-published book ends up being a needle in the haystack. I would say that unless you already have a very large audience, so let's just say you have an Instagram with hundreds of thousands of followers, sure, self-publish. If you're like your normal professor who just has some students who may want to read your book and maybe a few executives here and there, you're probably going to need to get a real publisher if you want it to have any traction whatsoever, unfortunately.
Yep. So they're still gatekeeping in a way, for better or worse, even though, so many things have become sort of DIY
Yeah.
and you have the tools for it, but like you said, the status, the legitimacy, the able to actually, make an impact is more limited. My sense is self-publishing probably works if you're already famous, maybe you have an email list, maybe you have, avenues to market the book yourself, but probably at least for your first book, not the best avenue to do that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
like a lot of my coverage my book got, it wouldn't have gotten. Like my book ended up on, it was like the Wall Street Journal best business books of the year for their Christmas list, and they chose like four books, and mine was one of them. It would
Mhm.
not have been the case if it was self-published. Like they don't select self-published books for those kind of things, which is unfortunate. But it's kind of like in our field too. We have these too, like where you get your PhD from is used as a signal, even though it's not meaningful. Like, there are many people in our field who've gotten PhD. Like I got mine from Harvard. There were people on the market who were massively better than I was from much lower tier places. But like that PhD got me a little bit of extra lift there. So there's just these effects that unfortunately everyone uses signals, even when they're not the most sensible ones to use because it's just noisy.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, that's why we have signaling theory, right? It's
Yeah.
literally all about this phenomena.
Yeah.
Um, so as we start to wrap up, and I will leave a few minutes for questions as well. I have one last one from my end, which is you talked about AI and the inundation of books with AI. AI, obviously, as we're all discovering, is a great tool for many things. It can actually help you, do all kinds of research and help you edit. And at the same time, you don't want to be producing AI slop. You don't want to be producing something that's completely disconnected from yourself, both from like a personal meaning perspective, I imagine, and this just in terms of losing connection with the audience that you're writing to. So where do you see AI playing a good, healthy, legitimate role in a book writing, editing, marketing, publishing process? And where should it be left aside?
Mhm. Awesome question to end on. And I didn't know if anyone here had any Q&A too. But for me, there's a few useful places. So AI was like starting to become a thing as I was finishing up my writing. It was very useful for supplementing knowledge from me where I was missing it. In particular, like business books always have fun stories to go with the research. Like, I talk about Fire Festival and I talk about all these other like random like email chains that went crazy, like the Sony leaks and other things. And like, I didn't necessarily, I know the research really, really well because I've spent way too many hours as a professor during my PhD reading it. But in terms of like the quirky stories that fit it, I didn't know those as well. So AI was useful for helping me to think about, well, what's a good story I could include here to hook people into potentially denser research construct. And obviously, I had to check that because I'd be like, oh, that's a great story that AI had. Let me go Google it to get more details about it. AI made it up completely. There's no like, they name a real executive, a real situation, never happened. So obviously, you always want to check that. But I got some good stories from the book, like some leads. Then I went kind of more down the rabbit hole, Wikipedia and, actually news articles to make sure that it happened and get more details on it. But it gave me some good direction. I think AI is also good for proofing. Whenever I do ask AI to proof my writing, I ask it what are the typos? Don't rewrite it. Generally, so that I can identify the typos. The reason being is that, as we've all seen, AI writing sounds like AI writing. And the thing is, it's a big turnoff for people. We all know it. And if people want to read your book and they're paying for your expertise and it feels like AI wrote it, they're gonna not be very happy. And it can help with getting past a writer's block. Like if you're really stuck on a sentence, it can get you started on it. So for me, information, copy editing, make sure I don't have bad typos, and getting me past like writer's block, or if I'm not sure exactly how to word something. But I'd be very personally cautious about having it write paragraphs or anything like that because it's going to read like AI wrote your book and it's going to cause a variety of problems.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Wonderful. So we have about a minute or so left and would love to hear from the audience. Any questions as we wrap up?
I have just one last question. You wrote a book already. You're thinking about possibly another book. Uh, have you thought about maybe going into like doing podcasts, not just being on podcasts? You said you've been on some of those, but starting your own or some other media to get your message out there? Or why would you,
Hmm.
what makes you want to stick with another book instead of some other avenue?
It's a great question. So as part of publicity, I was like on over 30 podcasts. I'm like on a podcast. I'm still getting podcast invites one off. So I'm doing a podcast for with Steelcase. So, like the office chair company that sells like really nice chairs and other things. I'm doing one for them actually next week. But um, so first off, just simply everyone and their mother started a podcast at this point. It is so absolutely crowded. And unless you have a pre-existing audience, the only person probably listening is your mother to that podcast for the most part. So I mean, these things have become really, really overcrowded. I like the book because it's very focused. It's one thing you do it, you publicize it, as opposed to like I'm doing a podcast over and over and over again every week. And for me, the book, it kind of adds that extra legitimacy to it that's already involved. Like you have a major publisher, you can put a publicist behind it that's kind of already into it, as opposed to like starting a podcast is you're basically an entrepreneur where you have to start from scratch. You're building up everything from scratch. Whereas if you can get an agent, you can get a book deal, like a lot of that legitimacy is already built for you. You're starting on third base effectively, as opposed to starting on first base.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really, really useful way of looking at it. And, we're lucky that we live in an era of, there's so many opportunities for us now. And like, the hard part for it is figuring out what to do with it. Um, so yeah, being able to put all of these different options into perspective is incredibly helpful. So thank you, Andrew. This has been wonderful, really, really informative time together, spending this hour with you. Also, just good for me to catch up with you. So thank you for making the time. Thank you to the audience for being here. And we hope to see and hear more from you as time goes on.
Right. And thanks for hosting this session. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.